So, as you can tell from the title of this talk, it is clearly about the .idea folder and Git. Sorry if the talk isn't titled in a way that's super easy to understand, but you can figure it out from that usually. My name is Harry Grillo. I am an Android developer with a studio up in New York, up in Boston. Sorry, we're in New York now. That is owned by Accenture, so we're a large consulting agency. We do a lot of mobile development and other types of development for a wide range of clients. And I decided to talk about the idea folder and its reaction to Git, its relation to Git, because I noticed that a lot of developers, including a lot of senior developers, didn't really dive into it much and didn't really know what to expect with it. So to quickly look at the components of what this talk is about, what is the .idea folder? You probably run into this if you've used Android Studio at all, but it originally comes from the IDE in IntelliJ built by JetBrains, which is a Java IDE used for a large range of stuff, not just mobile development. But importantly, this is the IDE from which Android Studio is forked, hence why we have the .idea folder in Android Studio. And IntelliJ projects, and by extension Android Studio projects, come in a couple of flavors for their structures. There is the older format, which is the file-based format, and this is IPR, IML, and IWS files. And then there is a newer structure that's taken over in the past number of years that they're using now, which is considered standard, which is directory-based. That's the .idea folder as we use it today. The other part of this talk, beyond that folder, is about version control. So most people are using version control, I think, across Android development, certainly. But if you haven't used it, it is simply a way of sharing and keeping a history of your code and how you work on it over time, with the ability to roll back and the ability to share things with other people. I think within the Android world, Git is pretty standard for version control, but there are definitely a whole lot of other options out there. So while I talk about Git in this talk, in the title especially, most of this can be applied to other version control. I'm just talking about what you're sharing, nothing that's specific to Git particularly. Speaking about Git, the way that we choose what is shared by Git is the .gitignore file. And this file contains essentially a list of things to not ignore, or in a few limited cases, things to not ignore. This talk was originally started back when the gitignore file was really kind of spotty on what it excluded from the idea folder and what it included, but they actually updated the default that you get when you start a new project in Android Studio very recently, and it now includes this set of lines about the idea folder, which actually are pretty much my suggestions from the talk. So a lot of what I have to say now is explain why those are there, and a lot less about telling you what you should change in your project necessarily. If you have an older one, though, that you're not just starting, or an old gitignore, definitely worth taking a look at it. And there are a lot of other suggestions out online, so what I'm saying is by all means just a general idea of what you should and shouldn't have in there. Definitely research it further and whether it applies to your project. So with that, let's take a look at some of the stuff that should be ignored, that's in that directory that's hidden so you don't look at it very often. There's a folder called libraries, and as you can imagine, this has to do with the libraries that you have in your project. Specifically, it holds a lot of metadata around the libraries and the modules that are in the project and how the IDE represents them to you on the screen and how they're accessible. So this is in the do not include list because in this day and age we have a lot of dependency management tools that are designed to streamline the process of importing code. Specifically, if you're using Gradle and all your dependencies are in Gradle, that is designed to be able to replicate the setup of external dependencies that you want at the right version, at the right configuration, every time it's run on a new machine. You shouldn't need to include all the library metadata in your IDE settings. It's already in your source code for the project. Another thing that you should not put into your Git repo is your workspace.xml. This is a file that is a great example of things that are very specific to specific developers. This literally is a file that allows Android Studio to cache and persist the state of your IDE windows between sessions. That's why when you quit Android Studio and re-enter, it's set up the way you expect it. This includes things like editor tabs, where your cursor is in a file, where your windows are and how they're set up, and what your run targets are for when you run your code. All things that you wouldn't necessarily want to be checking into version control, both because they're not applicable to other developers and because they're going to change constantly. Little files like asset wizard settings.xml. This is literally just when you go and you add an asset to the Asset Studio in Android Studio. This is just a persisted version of all those settings. That's why when you reopen this window after having used it previously, you have all the previous settings you used last time. Again, this is just sort of cached data from the IDE that isn't really relevant to backup. And this is the sort of stuff that causes a lot of people to just exclude the directory entirely. Likewise, caches is a folder which by name you can tell you do not expect to persist anything in. It is cache data. And this one's actually interesting because what it caches specifically are your Gradle files. This is the folder that stores a checksum of all of your Gradle build files so that you see this when you make a change to it. Likewise, if you're not seeing this, it might be because your caches folder is not correctly recognizing that something has changed from there. Or vice versa, if you're seeing it a lot, your caches folder may not be there when it should be. So that's a list of sort of stuff that, this is why people tend to exclude this from Git. They tend to just go into their gitignore and put .idea/ and leave it at that. Just don't put anything in from that directory. But what a lot of people are missing out on when they do that is that there are things that you can share that you do want your IDE to synchronize between your developers. For example, code styles. If you make changes to how you style code and format code in your project, you probably want everyone on the team to have the IDE auto-format in the same format. Doing that is very simple with the code styles folder inside the .idea folder. This will synchronize that between all of your developers. Doesn't change often, and you want everyone to have it. Likewise, dictionaries. This is where anything that you right-click on and you say, add word to dictionary, this is where it ends up. And this will have a list of files, one for every developer on the team with their username as the name. And Android Studio collects everything in this folder, puts it into a master list, and those things are no longer going to be represented as typos in the IDE for anyone on the team. Great if you have a startup or other weird product with a weird spelling that it constantly wants to correct for you. Inspection profiles is again very similar, and this is for anything lint related. So this is where if you have any custom lint rules or you have lint set to run a special check or ignore some checks, this is where that will get backed up to. And again, good to have it on all the developer machines so that you make sure everyone is running the same lint. That way you do not run lint, see a different set of warnings than your coworker does when they do it, and wonder why you're seeing different warnings on your code. Misc.xml. This one gets excluded a lot previously because it used to change somewhat frequently. There was a bug within Android Studio where this contains your Java version, so it would fluctuate Java versions sometimes, and every commit, the Java version would switch, so it would show up in your staging again for Git. I think that's been fixed at this point, so it doesn't seem to happen anymore. So this includes things like your Java version, what type of project it is, and a whole lot more weird, obscure data about the project, not about the user, like workspace.xml. I highly recommend looking at this file. I didn't really list everything in it because it's a lot of weird little data points. You won't understand what most of the stuff in it is, but it's interesting to see how much data about your project Android Studio has that can be shared between developers that will make the configuration much more easy when a new developer rolls on or uses a new computer or something. New in Android Studio 3.3 is the nav editor for navigation layouts editing. So this file, this XML file, just contains things like where things are laid out on that screen visually, even though that's not relevant to the app, it's just relevant to you using the tooling. Interestingly, the Android components team actually puts this in the gitignore by default. And I recommend unignoring this one potentially so that when you make a choice about how you want to visually lay things out in the editor, it will be shared across your team. Goes either way, figure out what works for you, but I think it makes sense in a lot of cases to have that layout consistent. Run configurations. Anytime you add a new run configuration to your project, especially large projects with a lot of different modules or a lot of different entry points into the app, will have different run configurations. There's a lot of settings you can set in a run configuration, and it's a real pain to just share like a wiki page with all the list of things you want to check and uncheck so that other developers know how to get that configuration. Share this in a single XML file in your Git, and it will show up on everyone's machine the same way all the time, and everyone's changes will be tracked. And the last file that I put on my list specifically to recommend you include is vcs.xml for your version control system. And given that this is a talk about Git and the .idea folder, I recommend checking in your version control information. This will make sure, this has the configuration to say what type of VCS you're using and how you have it set up. And if you use, especially if you use Android Studio to do your version control as opposed to an external Git or other version control client, having this file in there will again make sure your team is all set up the same way. And since it's shared in the same repo that you are talking about doing version control on, it makes a lot of sense to have it in there. There's plenty more in that directory. This is just sort of an overview of some of the stuff that I've run into commonly being in there in a lot of projects. You may not have some of it. There may be more that you don't see here. So pretty much you can choose pretty easily what you want to add or not add to your gitignore, what you want to share and what you don't want to share. And there's a few pretty simple things to think about before you do it. Is it something that is not unique to your machine? Is there a reason for this to run on a different computer, or is it relevant to just your configuration and your environment on your computer? Likewise, would it be useful to teammates if it were on their computer? Is this not just sort of some personal preference to have one thing one way or another? If it's little things like how your windows are laid out or something, no reason to have that in version control, because another developer is going to want to do that entirely differently. Is it something that stays the same and does not change in every commit? As I said earlier with that bug in the Java version in the nisp.xml, you don't want something that's going to be just constantly changing value, like every time you change something in the window it moves a little bit, because then it's going to show up in every single commit and it'll be really hard to, it'll pollute your commit history very quickly with all these little one-line changes that are not relevant to the project. And also make sure that it's something specific to the project, not the IDE. There is a separate way to set up settings and share settings for the IDE that is not on a project per project basis. This is a directory that's checked in with the source code of your project, so you want it to be relevant to that project. On the wider scale, if you want to do things like IDE settings, you can export pretty much the entirety of Android Studio's settings as a file that you can then share with other developers independently that's not related to the idea folder. So I highly recommend this if you want to share things like themes, company-wide code styles. We actually at Accenture use a company-wide code style that every developer has on their computer, and that way every project, regardless of whether it has a code style in the .idea folder for it, will look the same or work the same with the formatting. This is where, if you share your theme, if you share any of your other settings, do that as an external settings export. It won't be in your idea folder because it's not project related. So I hope that gave a pretty good idea of sort of a quick overview of what's in there. This talk's definitely, as I said, not meant to teach you the intricacies of everything in there. I don't expect you to remember all those files, but this is just sort of a quick overview so that when you go back and want to Google this later on your own to figure out what you should have in there, you have a sense of what you're looking at. Highly recommend doing so. If you have time on a current project, especially a big one with a lot of developers that's been going on for a long time, review your gitignore. Also for other things outside the idea folder, but with the idea folder especially, if the whole thing's ignored, talk to your team. Do you want to be sharing directories, code styles, etc. across the team? There are things like copyrights, if you have those little copyright headers on files. All of those can be completely shared via this directory. So yeah, that is that quick intro to that. I think that we are now up to lunch, so I'm not going to keep people around for questions or anything. I know that everyone likes a talk that gets out early before lunch, but I will be around if you want to talk to me at all. And thank you for coming.